Grace be unto you, and peace from God our Father, and from our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Our text for this Reformation Sunday is a single verse from the book of Colossians, chapter 3, verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. So far, the reading of our text, you may be seated. In Christ Jesus, dearly beloved fellow believers. Several years ago, I received as a gift, a record collection from a friend who was moving into a smaller space. Among the LPs in the collection were 6 recordings of the Emmanuel Lutheran College Choir, including their very first recording made in 1961, only 2 years after the opening of the school, then located in Mankato. And that record had the ILC choir on one side, and on the other side, some pieces by the Emmanuel Congregation Church Choir. Listening to these recordings after many years, I found the voices of the church choir especially strengthening. Those voices belong to Christians who, of course, by now have mostly finished their chorus and gone to be with the Lord. And yet, in those recordings, they still sing of the wondrous works of God for our salvation. To all who might still listen, they are teaching and admonishing us who are still in this life. With the words of the title piece from that album, "Sing, joyous Christians, sing forth your alleluias. Christ our Redeemer from death is risen, death and hell are conquered. Christ, have mercy." Well, the sound of Christian voices from the past in recordings is a powerful reminder of the truth of our text for this Reformation service. When Christians gather for worship, as we are doing today, and sing liturgy, hymns, sometimes anthems, they are teaching and admonishing one another, for they are singing to the Lord with the grace of God in their hearts. This spiritual truth and its importance in the lives of believers, these things were well known and understood by the reformers of the 16th century, especially Martin Luther himself. He saw that the Reformation of the Church needed to include the restoration of congregational singing to the worship service. And not just congregational singing, but the singing of hymns that are an expression of the Christian faith as it is revealed in the Holy Scriptures. You know that at that time, at the time of the Reformation and before, the common people who came to the worship service on Sunday morning did not really participate in the service very much. Certainly not with singing. That was done by the clergy and by choirs. And people were mostly observers. Of course, before that time, you go back a ways, and congregations of Christians did sing. And we see that that was true already in the days of the apostles, and going back to Old Testament times, as we see from our text for this morning. Well, it was from this conviction of Luther and others that congregations gathering for worship needed to sing hymns that Lutheran hymnody was born, grew, and developed. It is this treasure that has been passed down to us from the Reformation that we wish to remember and celebrate today. And our theme for this Reformation sermon is Singing with Grace in Our Hearts, the Treasure of Lutheran Hymnody. Paul begins this exhortation about the use of music and singing in the congregational worship service with this admonition. let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, in all wisdom. This is the main thing for believers, that the word of Christ should dwell in us. It's not enough that we should be known as Christians, that our friends and neighbors and family members should think of us as Christians. Certainly not enough that our name should be on the membership list of a Christian congregation. It's necessary that the word of Christ should live in us, in our hearts, in our innermost being. And that takes place when the Holy Spirit, working through the gospel and word and sacrament, brings us to faith in Jesus Christ as our Savior, and then preserves and strengthens that faith in us throughout our life unto life everlasting. Well, because it's so vital that the word of Christ should dwell in us, it should be our desire that it should dwell in us richly, and that's what the apostle says. Now, it should dwell in us and dwell in us richly. Richly, so that we know the Lord's word, so that we don't have just one or just a few favorite Bible passages that we know, but we have rather many Bible passages that are deeply meaningful to us. Through our hearing and learning of the word over many years, many passages of Scripture have become precious to us. And portions of those, and words from those, come back to us during our daily lives. And it's also good for us to commit portions of the Bible to memory. We emphasize this, especially with children. As adults, we should continue to do this. We are able. This is letting the word of Christ dwell in us richly. And notice that when the word of Christ dwells in us richly, it is in all wisdom. In the word we have wisdom, divine wisdom, that wisdom that has to do with salvation through Jesus Christ. Now, when we think of the word dwelling in us richly, we probably first of all think of reading the Bible in personal devotions or listening to the sermon in the Sunday service. And you're right to think of those things here. But Paul calls to our attention something else that causes the word to dwell in us richly, something that we might not necessarily think of in this way. It is the singing of hymns and psalms and spiritual songs in our worship services. And the apostle is, of course, here talking about what we're doing exactly this morning, gathering together for worship. And it's one of a very mighty encouragement toward the gathering for worship. Paul says that when we sing hymns in the worship service, we teach and admonish one another. The truth of this statement is obvious when it is pointed out to us. When you sing hymns in church, you don't just benefit from seeing the words on the hymnal page. You don't just benefit from singing them out loud and thinking about what they mean, though certainly we benefit from all of these things, but we also benefit from hearing our fellow believers sing them. We're all singing to the Lord from the heart, but we're also singing to one another when we sing in church. We are saying to one another, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he came and died for me to free me from sin, death, and damnation. And so you are not alone in your faith. Keep on believing. That's what we're saying to one another. And how much we need to hear that from one another as we live, as we go on in this world where unbelief and ungodliness surround us. Now, if a hymn is to help us for the word of Christ to dwell in us richly, and if it is to teach us, then it needs to be an expression of what the word teaches, of course. It needs, therefore, to be more than an expression of the believer's personal devotion or feelings. Such hymns certainly have a place, especially in personal devotion. But for congregational singing, we especially need to have good, sound, teaching hymns. The best examples are Luther's own hymns, which set the tone for Lutheran hymnody from the very beginning. And this was so from the beginning of Luther's work as a hymn writer. In 1523, he wrote his first congregational hymn. You know, that's only a few years after 1517, which marks kind of the beginning of the Reformation. He wrote his first congregational hymn, and that's Dear Christians, One and All Rejoice. It's number 387 in the Lutheran hymnal. And let's sing this hymn together now. This morning we'll just take stanzas 1, 2, 5, and 6. Soon after he composed this great hymn, Luther published the first Lutheran hymnal. It was a collection of only 8 hymns, 4 of which were written by Luther himself, 3 by an associate of Luther's, a man named Paul Speratus, and there was another one by an unknown author. It is said of this first hymnal of 8 hymns that this is the tiny spring from which sprang the mighty stream of Lutheran hymnody. Merle d'Aubigné, in his biography of Luther, writes that other children of the Reformation followed Luther's footsteps. Hymns were multiplied. They spread rapidly among the people and powerfully contributed to rouse them from sleep. Luther's most famous hymn is, of course, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." It's based on Psalm 46, which begins, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." And the God that Luther sees and understands in Psalm 46 is not some vague deity who has great power. It is the one true and living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Luther understands that the Lord of hosts, in the Psalm's refrain, is none other than our Lord Jesus Christ, God the Son. Christ is the valiant one whom God himself elected. He is the one who fights for us. The cause of the Reformation was Christ because it was his gospel. It was the message of the Reformation. Luther's doctrine was that we are saved by the work of Christ alone. His atoning sacrifice alone has cleansed us from all our sins. His righteousness, which is ours now by faith, alone justifies us before God. Luther believed that even the devil himself could not stop the cause of the gospel because Christ, with his death and resurrection, had defeated the devil and robbed him of his power. This world's prince may still scowl fierce as he will. He can harm us not. He's judged. The deed is done. Now, because the Reformation began and grew in Germany, primarily, the hymnody that grew in the Lutheran Church was largely written in the German language. These great hymns wouldn't have been of any use to Lutherans and other Christians who spoke other languages and didn't know German. They wouldn't have been of any use to us in the United States who speak English without someone to translate these things into the English language. The God who gave the gifts of hymn writing to Luther and others also provided the gifts to render them in English. Among those who had such gifts, one name especially stands out that I'd like to talk about for a bit this morning, Catherine Winkworth. The extent of her work can be seen in the Lutheran hymnal, which includes no less than 73 hymns that are either her translations or based on her translations. We just sang one of them, number 261. They include hymns for all seasons of the church year, as well as hymns on baptism and Holy Communion. Let's begin our consideration of her work in Lutheran hymnody by singing a familiar hymn that's one of her many translations, number 237, All Glory Be to God on High.
Amen.
who made so many of our hymns available to us in the English language. Well, Catherine Winkworth was born in London in the year 1827. And it appears that her interest in the German Lutheran hymns was sparked by a gift that she received. It was a devotional book in the German language that she received from a man named Bunsen, who was the German ambassador to England, a close personal friend of the Winkworth family. Catherine and her elder sister Susanna were both very gifted linguists and fluent in the German language. Catherine herself also spent some time in Germany. And they worked together translating a number of German books for publication in the English language, besides her work in Lutheran hymns. In fact, one of the books that they translated from German into English and published was a biography of Luther. Well, with her gift for languages and poetry, Catherine began to translate the German hymns. And while still in her 20s, she published a collection of her translations, which was an immediate success. She published a second collection a few years later, and then in a third book, she put the earlier translations with the chorale tunes. She also wrote a collection of biographies of German hymn writers. She's called German Singers, Christian Singers in Germany. Well, Catherine Winkworth's work is important to us because it's the principal means by which the great German Lutheran hymns have been made available to us for use in our worship. And think of what a blessing that's been over so many years. Her translations include such treasures as "All Glory Be to God on High," the great Trinitarian hymn which we just sang, which is familiar to us because that first stanza has been used in a lot of our churches in the liturgy. Other hymns, "Now Thank We All Our God," "Christ the Life of All the Living," the Easter hymn, "Jesus Christ, My Sure Defense," the Communion hymn, "Soul Adorn Thyself with Gladness," the Reformation hymn, "Lord Keep Us Steadfast in Thy Word," which I mentioned earlier, "Wait, Await, for Now It's Flying," and so many others. Now, people who look at the Lutheran hymnal or visit our services sometimes express surprise and perhaps puzzlement. Why do you sing so many old hymns? I've had that question addressed to me. Well, the answer is because they're such good hymns. They fulfill the qualifications of our text. They teach the Word of Christ. But now that is not to say that no good hymns have not been written since the time of the Reformation or other times long ago. It's not to say that good hymns are not still being written in our time. For example, the worship supplement contains 3 hymns by a man named Yaroslav Vaida. Now, despite his very Slavic, old worldish sounding name, he was an American hymn writer who lived from 1919 to 2008. As a young man, he studied for the ministry and served as a Lutheran pastor for about 15 years, and then he became a book editor and developer for Concordia Publishing House. But early in his life, he started translating poetry into English from the Slovak language. But he didn't write his first hymn until the age of 49, which is kind of a late start, isn't it, in that kind of work. But from then on until his death, he wrote and translated over 200 hymns that now appear in many hymnals, including, as I said, the worship supplement. And one of them we will be singing as our closing hymn in the service today. "Go, my children, with my blessing." A hymn that I believe has become quite popular among us since the publication of the worship supplement. It's based on the benediction, the Aaronic blessing with which we close our Sunday services. It interprets the benediction according to the revelation that God has given us in the Bible, particularly the light that we have from the New Testament to understand that treasure it is that God has given us in our Lutheran hymnody. In our hymns we sing praises to God. In them we sing of His wonderful works in Jesus Christ for our salvation. In them we teach and admonish one another, singing with His grace in our hearts. Amen. And may the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Amen.